I hadn't wanted to come alone. My cousin's wedding was the kind of event where everyone arrives in pairs, where the seating chart assumes you belong to somebody, and where the empty chair beside you might as well have a spotlight on it. I'd told myself I didn't care. I told myself a lot of things that year that weren't true. My name is Claire, I was 31, and 6 months earlier my engagement had ended in the ugliest, quietest way possible. Not with a fight, but with a text message that started with, "I think we both know," and ended with nothing at all. So when I walked into that reception hall in Charleston, in a green dress, I'd bought specifically because it made me feel like someone who had her life together, I sat down at a round table near the back and prepared to spend the next 4 hours pretending I was fine. That was when he sat down. He didn't ask if the seat was taken. He just lowered himself into the chair beside me with the kind of exhausted relief of a man who had been standing at the edge of a room for too long, working up the nerve to do something. He was maybe 35, dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, wearing a suit that fit him well but looked borrowed from a more confident version of himself. He turned to me, and before I could even process that a stranger had just sat down next to me at my own family's wedding, he said, low and urgent, "I know this is insane, I know, but please, pretend you know me, just for the next hour. I'll explain everything, I promise, just please." I should have said no. I should have looked around for security, or at the very least raised an eyebrow and asked him who exactly he thought I was. But there was something in his voice that wasn't creepy or predatory, it was scared. Genuinely, nakedly scared. The way people sound right before they do something they've been dreading for years. And maybe it was the 2 glasses of champagne. Or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't felt needed by anyone in 6 months, and some small, aching part of me leaned toward it like warmth. So I said, "Okay, but you owe me the whole story." His name was Daniel. He explained it in pieces, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds toward the bridal party's table, where an older couple sat rigid and formal, dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine about old money. The bride, it turned out, was his half-sister, a relationship neither of them had chosen and neither of them had ever quite made peace with. Their father had left Daniel's mother when Daniel was 4, married into this new polished family, and spent the next 3 decades treating Daniel like an obligation instead of a son. Daniel hadn't been invited to speak, hadn't been given a seat at the family table, had in fact only been invited at all because his sister, the one person in that family who still saw him as more than an inconvenience, had insisted. And now his father was walking toward our table with the specific, deliberate stride of a man who had been waiting all evening for an opportunity to remind Daniel exactly where he stood. "He's going to ask why I'm alone," Daniel said quietly, not looking at me, looking instead at his hands. "He's going to say something about how I never bring anyone, how I never settle down, how that's probably why Mom—" He stopped himself. I just needed one night where he couldn't do that, where I wasn't the sad single failure at the end of the table. "I saw you sitting alone and I thought, God, that sounds terrible when I say it out loud." "It sounds human," I said, surprising myself. "Terribly embarrassingly human. I relate to it more than you know." His father arrived at our table like weather. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that had curdled slightly into something colder with age. He didn't greet Daniel so much as inspect him, eyes moving from his shoes to his collar and then, finally, to me. "And who is this?" he asked in a tone that suggested he already expected the answer to disappoint him. "This is Claire," Daniel said, and I felt his hand find mine on the table, warm and slightly trembling. "We've been seeing each other for a few months. I wanted to keep it quiet until I was sure, but here we are." I smiled the way you smile in family photographs, the practiced, easy smile that says nothing is wrong here, and said, "It's lovely to finally meet you." Daniel talks about his family a lot, which was, in its own way, true. He had, in the last 20 minutes, told me more about this family than most people share in years. His father's expression didn't soften exactly, but it recalibrated. The way a man recalibrates when a tool he expected to be broken turns out to work. He asked me polite, cursory questions and where I was from, what I did, and I answered them honestly, because lying about myself felt unnecessary when the only lie that mattered was sitting beside me holding my hand like it was the only solid thing in the room. When his father finally moved on to interrogate someone else's happiness, Daniel exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 30 years. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "No," I agreed. "But you looked like you needed someone in your corner." "I know what that's like. Needing someone in your corner and not having anyone show up." That was when he really looked at me. Not at the woman playing a part, but at me, Claire, in her green dress with her tired eyes and her fine, practiced smile. "What happened to you?" he asked, and it wasn't intrusive the way strangers' questions usually are. It sounded like he actually wanted to know. So I told him about Mark, about the 5 years we'd spent building a life that turned out to be built on nothing, about the text message, about how I'd shown up to this wedding alone because every other option felt like admitting defeat. Daniel listened the way almost no one had listened to me in months, not waiting for his turn to talk, not offering the tired, well-meaning platitudes people default to. He just listened. And when I was done, he said, "For what it's worth, any man who ends a 5-year relationship over text doesn't deserve an explanation of what he lost. He forfeited the right to understand it." We stayed like that through dinner, through the toasts, through the excruciating slideshow of the couple's childhood photos. What started as a favor between two strangers slid, slowly and without either of us quite noticing the exact moment it happened, into something that felt less like performance and more like company. He made me laugh, really laugh. Not the polite kind, telling me about the disastrous best man speech he'd once given at a friend's wedding that ended with him accidentally revealing the groom's college nickname to the groom's very Catholic grandmother. I told him about the time I'd tried to bake a wedding cake for my roommate, and it collapsed so completely that we ended up serving it in bowls, calling it deconstructed. Somewhere between the dinner and the dancing, I realized I had stopped keeping track of how long I was supposed to be pretending. When the band started playing something slow, Daniel stood and held out his hand, and this time there was no urgency in his voice, no desperation. "You don't have to," he said. "The performance is over. His attention's elsewhere now. But I'd like to dance with you anyway, if that's all right." I took his hand. We danced under string lights that had been hung across the reception hall's garden, and somewhere in the middle of that song, I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest since dinner. Was any of tonight real? Or was I just a very convincing prop? He was quiet for a moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. The same fear from earlier, but pointed somewhere new now. "The favor was real," he said finally. "I needed someone tonight, and you saved me from something I've been dreading my whole life. But somewhere around the time you told me about the deconstructed wedding cake, I stopped thinking of you as someone I was using and started thinking of you as someone I very badly didn't want the night to end with." He paused. "I know that's a strange thing to admit to someone I met 2 hours ago under false pretenses. I know I have absolutely no right to ask for anything more than what you've already given me." I thought about Mark, about the 5 years I'd spent trying to be enough for someone who had already quietly decided I wasn't, about how exhausting it was to keep performing a life instead of living one. And I thought about the last 2 hours. How strange it was that the most honest conversation I'd had in 6 months had started with a lie. "Ask me to dinner," I said. "Not pretend dinner. Real dinner, where you show up as yourself and I show up as myself, and we see if any of this holds up outside of a wedding and 2 glasses of champagne." He smiled then, the first unguarded smile I'd seen from him all night, and it changed his whole face. Took 10 years and a lifetime of careful, guarded posturing off it. "Claire," he said, "would you have dinner with me on Thursday? As yourself, as me. No pretending required." "Yes," I said. "I'd like that very much." We danced until the band packed up, until his father left without so much as a nod in either of our directions, until the bride found us both and hugged Daniel so hard he nearly stumbled, whispering something in his ear that made him laugh and glance at me with an expression I hadn't seen on a man's face in a very long time, something like hope that hadn't yet learned to be afraid of itself again. Thursday came, and he showed up at the restaurant 12 minutes early, wearing a suit that actually looked like it belonged to him this time, holding a single sunflower because, he said, roses felt like something you'd bring on a first date you were performing rather than one you actually wanted. We talked for 4 hours. Neither of us mentioned the wedding once, except at the very end when he walked me to my car and said, "I owe that entire family a B. Thank you card for the worst dinner seating arrangement of my life. If they'd put me anywhere else, I never would have found you." It's been 8 months now. Daniel and I moved in together in the spring, into a small house with a garden he insists on filling with sunflowers, though I keep telling him they attract too many bees. His father still hasn't fully come around, but Daniel says that's all right. He's stopped needing that particular door to open in order to feel like his life is whole. Last week, his sister called to ask if we'd be her +1 and +2 at her own vow renewal next year, and Daniel laughed so hard he had to put the phone down, because apparently the woman he'd once used as a cover story was now officially family. Sometimes I think about that green dress, about how close I came to leaving that reception early, about the exact, ordinary randomness of a stranger choosing the one empty seat beside me instead of any other seat in that hall. I think about how a lie born out of fear turned, slowly and without either of us forcing it, into the truest thing either of us had said in years. People ask me sometimes how we met, expecting some tidy romantic story, and I tell them the truth. He sat down beside me at a wedding and asked me to pretend I knew him. What I don't always say is that somewhere in the middle of that pretending, I actually did